Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of part 1 of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World. Chapter 4 is titled Bureaucratic Exploitation. Quote, "If it is true that the USSR has stabilized into a new social form different from either capitalism or socialism, and that in place of the new bourgeoisie another ruling class has arisen, then you must explain to us what is the new form of exploitation and by what means surplus value is extracted from the workers." End quote. This is more or less what scientific Marxists have a perfect right to say, and we will do our best to answer them. If Trotsky is in agreement with Neville that I don't know who that quote is from. If Trotsky is in agreement with Neville that nationalized property is a characteristic of a worker state, the master can surely not agree with his disciple in considering land rent and surplus value in the land of Stalin as nationalized. Here is what Trotsky says in The Revolution Betrayed. Quote, "If we translate socialist relations for illustration into the language of the market, we may represent the citizen as a stockholder in a company which owns the wealth of the country. If the property belongs to all the people, that would presume an equal distribution of, quote, shares, and consequently a right to the same dividend for all, quote, shareholders. The citizens participate in the national enterprise, however, not only as, quote, shareholders, end quote, but also as producers. On the lower stage of communism, which we have agreed to call socialism, payments for labor are still made according to bourgeois norms, that is, independence upon skill, intensity, etc. The theoretical income of each citizen is thus composed of two parts, A plus B, that is, dividend plus wages. The higher the technique and the more complete the organization of industry, the greater is the place occupied by the dividend as against wages, and the less is the influence of individual differences of labor upon standard of living. From the fact that wage differences in the Soviet Union are not less, but greater than in capitalist countries, it must be inferred that the shares of the Soviet citizen are not equally distributed, and that in income, the dividend as well as the wage payment is unequal. Whereas the unskilled laborer receives only wages, the minimum payment which under similar conditions he would receive in a capitalist enterprise, the Stakhanovite receives 2 dividends plus a wage, or 3 dividends plus a wage, etc., while the wage also in its turn may become 2 wages, 3 wages, etc. The difference in income are determined, in other words, not only by differences of individual productiveness, but also by a massed appropriation of producers of the labor of others. The privileged minority of shareholders is living at the expense of the deprived majority. If you assume that the Soviet unskilled worker receives more than the Soviet unskilled worker would under a similar level of technique and culture in a capitalist enterprise, that is to say, that the Soviet skilled worker is still a small shareholder, Soviet unskilled worker is still a small shareholder, it is necessary to consider his wages as equal to dividend plus wage. The wages of the higher categories will be expressed with the formula 3 dividends, 2 wages, or 10 dividends plus 15 wages, etc. This means that the unskilled worker has 1 share, the Stakhanovite 3, the specialist 10. Moreover, their wages in the proper sense are related to as 1 to 2 to 15. Moreover, their wages in the proper sense, hymns to the sacred socialist property sound under these conditions a good deal more convincing to the manager of the Stakhanovite than to the rank-and-file worker or collective peasant. The rank-and-file workers, however, are the overwhelming majority of society. It is they and not the new aristocracy that socialism had in mind." End quote. Trotsky. Did you say that was from Revolution Betrayed? Yes. That last quote was from The Revolution Betrayed. We completely agree, and if Trotsky says a privileged minority is living on the backs of a deprived majority, we think Neville, too, will be convinced. We do not dare to hope that anybody will read us, but it does seem to us, in passing, that if the nationalization of surplus value and land rent benefit only the bureaucrats, then it is permissible to consider that the nationalized property also belongs to the bureaucrats and does not belong to the whole of society, a state of affairs which would really be socialist. The French lieutenant, good disciple that he is, has drawn from his master's concepts conclusions concerning Soviet property. The deduction is correct, but because the premise is incorrect, the conclusion is bound to be mistaken. Whatever he thinks of Trotsky, however great he considers him, he must learn that men of genius are but human, and are therefore fallible. Even the mediocrities amongst us can sometimes point out faults in great men. Neville very aptly cites an interesting fragment from Marx's Capital. Quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationships of rulers and ruled, as it grows directly out of production itself and in turn reacts upon it as a determining element. Upon this, however, is founded the entire formation of the economic community, which grows up out of the production relations themselves. Thereby, simultaneously its specific political form. It is always the direct relationship of the owner of the conditions of production to the direct producer, a relation always naturally corresponding to a definite state in the development of the methods of labor, and thereby its social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire world social structure, and with it, the political form of the relation of sovereignty and dependence. In short, the corresponding specific form of the state. This does not prevent the same economic basis, the same from the standpoint of its main conditions, due to innumerable different empirical circumstances, natural environment, racial relations, external historical influences, etc., from showing infinite variations and gradations in appearance, which can be ascertained only by analysis of the empirically given circumstances. End quote. Marx. Capital. We might imagine that Marx had only just written all that. We too completely agree with the intimate secret of the social edifice is revealed in the economic. We too completely agree that the intimate secret of the social edifice is revealed in the economic form in which surplus value is extracted from the immediate producers. But if this surplus value goes to a privileged class and land rent from the kolkhozes goes to the same place, as Trotsky demonstrates, and does not go to the state, as Neville, with his naive kolkhoz example, would have us believe, this proves that the Soviet bureaucratic class is no phantom, but is a ruling and exploiting class. And here is Neville's kolkhoz example, where Neville shows us how only 37% of production goes to the workers and the remainder to the state. Of that remainder, only part goes to the bureaucracy. Quote, an example, here is how land rent goes back to the state. The distribution of cash and of produce in a kolkhoz is carried out according to rules laid down by the government. First, the government exacts a levy which varies with the fertility of the region, and which can amount to as much as 41% of the harvest. Then 2 to 3% are deducted for administrative expenses, 13 to 15% for amortization of tractors and agricultural machinery, and finally 10.5% is put into reserve funds. What remains is shared among the workers according to the amount and quality of the work they have carried out. End quote. The essential thing to see is whether the bureaucrats, out of the percentages that go to administrative expenses, are paid wages on a par with the average wage of workers. But still more interesting is to see what this Soviet state does with the 60% of production that it takes. Does it put the whole of this surplus value back into circulation in the interest of the masses who stand outside government, or does it direct it? with interest to those areas which are especially dear to a class state? The answer is almost superfluous. Jesus Christ washed his feet first before letting the apostles have their turn. All the literature of the Knights of Agramant themselves is there to accuse them. Quote, the wide salary differentials between Soviet citizens, the growing differences between classes, the new bureaucracy, the Soviet aristocracy, the lion's share, 40% of production swallowed up by the bureaucracy, growing social antagonisms, inequalities, and so on. End quote. Only the candid naivete of the Philistine Neville would imagine that surplus value extracted from the Soviet workers could in large part be returned to them via a so-called, quote, workers' state, end quote. In reality, the bureaucratic state channels surplus value in various ways to its functionaries, forming a privileged class installed within the state. We too had never seen a ruling class without a had never seen the ruling class without a bureaucracy directly under the control of the state, nor had we seen a bureaucracy which was also the ruling class. But there is no doubt that today that is what we are seeing, and moreover we are quite sure that we are not fooling ourselves. We are sorry to have to say it, but these knights of our Agramant are tilting at windmills. Don Quixotes scurrying about the infernal field of discord into which an avenging archangel has thrown them. But we believe that the social reality is precisely as we have said. These are history's jokes, little revolutionary embarrassments for scientific and Philistine Marxists. We must grant, to be honest, that Neville does realize that Soviet bureaucrats are not indifferent to the mountains of surplus value amassed by the workers' state. Neville points out that, quote, the Stalinists continually repeat that surplus value no longer exists in the USSR because, quote, the factories belong to the workers, end quote, end quote. But it is no good replying to this absurdity with another, that surplus value is produced and redistributed as in the capitalist system, and that in consequence the relationships between master and non-master, to use Marx's expression, are similar. In reality, the specific form in which part of the unpaid surplus labor is appropriated confers the role and function of a semi-parasitic caste, and for certain strata of it, paves the way toward ownership. Quote, the wide difference in salaries, a striking and significant phenomenon, does not, however, exhaust the question of, quote, the inner secret of the hidden foundation of the whole edifice, end quote. The secret of this transitory state of the USSR and these new contradictions which it embraces is revealed, provided we do not lose sight of the true meaning of the nationalizations, provided we do not mask their true character with superficial analogies with the fascist statism of Mussolini or Hitler, end quote. Neville. How modest he finds these Soviet bureaucrats, nonetheless it is Neville himself who heaps insults upon them. These bureaucrats appropriate only a, quote, part, end quote, of the unpaid surplus labor. Who knows how to measure that part? And when Neville detects within the bureaucracy a, quote, semi-parasitic caste, and then Neville detects within the bureaucracy a, quote, semi-parasitic, end quote, class. This, quote, semi is amusing. By the same token, this caste should be semi-managing, semi-exploiting, and semi-owning. To tell the truth, the, quote, inner secret, end quote, is in no way exhausted by, quote, extreme salary differentials, end quote. These extreme salary differentials are only an indication. The inner secret lies in the relationship between the owners of the means of production and the immediate producers. In algebraic form, owners divided by producers equals inner secret. The denominator in the expression is given since the immediate producer represents the known constant in all social development, labor, end parenthesis. The numerator, on the other hand, varies because the form of property ownership varies with economic development. This term must be precisely defined, and we have found that it is represented by the bureaucracy, owner as a class of all the means of production. So we can write the equation as follows. Bureaucrats divided by producers equals inner secret. Without this new specification of ownership, the inner secret would always remain a mystery. And if, subsequently, we will then want to understand the relationship of dependency between master and non-master, we have to look at how surplus value is extracted from the immediate producers. In Soviet society, the exploiters do not appropriate surplus value directly. As the capitalist pockets the dividends from his enterprise, they do it indirectly, through the state, which appropriates the whole national surplus value and then distributes it among its own functionaries. A good part of the bureaucracy, that is to say, technicians, directors, specialists, econovites, profiteers, etc., is authorized, in one way or another, to exact its high salaries directly within the enterprises they control. Over and above this, they also enjoy, as do all bureaucrats, state services provided out of surplus value, and in the USSR these services are both numerous and important, as befits the pattern of, quote, socialist, end quote, life. Altogether, the bureaucracy extracts surplus value from the direct producers by means of a colossal markup of general expenses within the, quote, nationalized, end quote, industries. It is not a question of 2 or 3% for the administrative costs, as in Neville's celebrated kolkhoz, but of enormous percentages, enough to make the hair of the most barefaced capitalist stand on end, which are instanced in the work of Trotsky himself. And so we see exploitation changing from an individual pattern to a collective pattern. Following the change in the pattern of ownership, it is a matter of one class exploiting another, by virtue of its class ownership, and then through the state which it controls, distributing the proceeds to its members. Parenthesis, we can expect in due course bureaucratic charges. Parenthesis, we can expect in due course bureaucratic charges on this service! Exclamation point. End parenthesis. The new privilege swallows up the surplus value via the state machinery, which is not only an instrument of political oppression, but also the instrument of the economic administration of the nation. Machinery for both exploitation and the perpetuation of social privilege has been united in a single instrument and an effective instrument. Labor power is no longer bought by capitalists but monopolized by a single master, the state. Workers no longer offer their labor to different entrepreneurs, choosing the ones that suit them best. The law of supply and demand no longer functions. The workers are at the mercy of the state. Overhead costs of enterprises rise rapidly in the totalitarian states, as they do also in the great democracies, and these rising costs are an indication that everywhere, throughout the world, bureaucratic collectivism is taking shape and class ownership is crystallizing. In the USSR, the wages are fixed by the commission of the, quote, plan, end quote, that is to say, by the top bureaucrats. The same goes for sale prices to the public, and we can reasonably suppose that, between the production costs and the selling prices, the bureaucracy takes a good cut. Bureaucracy is very costly. Bureaucracy inflates production cost, and in order to cover its remuneration, more or less hidden, it also resorts to enormous markups of the selling price. The trade unionist Citrine, visiting a shoemaking factory, failed to get from the manager the selling price of the shoes they were showing him, but he did discover that in the factory shop the shoes cost 32 rubles, whilst in other shops he found the same shoes at 70 rubles. Note that the turnover of goods in the factory shops is very limited. The bureaucracy treats its workers like customers and sends them to buy in, quote, state shops. Under a system with, quote, socialist tendencies, end quote, an increase of 120% seems to us outrageous, especially when we realize that the capitalist businesses limit themselves for the same article to an average of 40%. It is the bureaucracy that maintains the accounts both for the enterprises and for the state, and even if it does not draw dividends, as in the capitalist of old, it distributes, according to its will, the sums accumulated. The whole meaning of Stalin's, quote, good life, end quote, lies in the margin between cost and selling prices set by the bureaucracy. in how capital reserves are deployed in, quote, public works, end quote, which are useful to the bureaucratic class. Neville will tell us that they are creating capital for the state and for the future when they establish great enterprises, carry out electrification, etc., etc. But show us when, anywhere, was there an exploiting class which was not obliged to do exactly that. The bourgeoisie, too, exploiting the proletariat, managed to lead quite a happy life, and at the same time create capital for, quote, humanity, end quote. The bourgeoisie has handed on to us the strongest, most perfect organization that the world has ever seen. The bourgeoisie did not do all that just to make a present to humanity, but because the necessities of developing production drove the bourgeoisie to perfect machines, to rationalize work scientifically, and to create model industries. It was not philanthropy, and the Soviet bureaucracy, by the same token, must create capital for the future, even if in essence it remains highly exploitative. That's the end of chapter 4 of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World, Part 1.